Welcome to Bangalore International Centre, a platform for informed dialogue, arts and culture. BIC Talks, our podcast, brings ideas and conversations ever closer to you.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. If you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, please leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. Joining me today is Dr. Indira Rajaraman, one of India's eminent economists who taught at IIM Bangalore for close to 2 decades and was a former member of the 13th Finance Commission. Also with me is Ravi Chander. We've had several rich conversations on BIC Talks about the COVID-19 pandemic, and today we will focus on how India should respond fiscally to the pandemic and to manage its effects on the health of Indians and its effect on the health of Indian economy. Dr. Rajaraman, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you.
First off, it's worth starting here. Dr. Rajaraman, was India's lockdown unavoidable? Was there any better way by which to fend off the spread of COVID-19?
At the time at which the lockdown was introduced on March the 24th, yes, it was unavoidable. But we have to remember that the disease came through a small number of international airports. And more than 2 months prior to March 24th, that is to say by January 24th, we already had a state in the country, Kerala state, which had instituted a system whereby they followed up on people coming into the country from outside and from China and East Asia particularly. And they followed them even if they did not declare symptoms at the airport. What we lacked at that time was an effective center state portal on which Kerala could have reported what they were doing and the rates of infection they discovered among those coming in from the outside who had not reported symptoms on arrival. Had this been done, had we had such a portal, and if the ministry at the center had paid attention to what Kerala was doing, if other airports in the country had followed suit, the lockdown could have been averted. The moral of the story is that we need much more continuous center-state communication, especially at a time like this, in order to avert the kind of catastrophe that has befallen us with this lockdown.
Thanks, Dr. Rajaraman. And now the lockdown is almost a fait accompli for us, and we've shut down the economy for a period of 6 weeks and counting. And how do you see the state and union governments viewing this lockdown and its extension and whatever we are hearing now about its phased withdrawal? Is there a difference in viewpoints, even if the goal is the same?
There is a slight difference in the incentive structure facing states, and that is because health is a state subject under the Indian Constitution, and there has been a historical inadequacy of health infrastructure in the states to meet even the normal disease burden, let alone the kind of surge that is posed by a disease like COVID. So on balance, states are more interested in extending the lockdown because they are fearful of what would happen if the surge were to hit them. At the same time, under the Indian Constitution, the responsibility for maintaining macroeconomic stability is vested squarely with the center, with the union government. There is Article 293.3 and many other articles in the Constitution where this message is driven home. That being the case, there is an incentive for states to shift to the union government, so to speak, the costs of maintaining macroeconomic stability, even as they press for the continuation of the lockdown.
So, Dr. Indira Rajaraman, we are recording this episode on April 28th, and we expect the lockdown to be phased out starting from May 4th or so. How do we exit this lockdown where the spread of the disease is continued to be curtailed? We don't have second outbreaks even in places where there has been control, while we start restoring livelihoods.
Even now, in the midst of lockdown 2, that is until May 3rd, as you know, transportation of all goods is allowed by road and rail, but truck operators, drivers, and cargo handlers are reluctant to return from their rural base to risk exposure to a disease which is perceived as of urban origin. Therefore, we need to institute a testing pathway along road and rail arterial routes. We need to introduce a passbook system so that all personnel traveling with cargo from all across the country are given a passbook with a history of the date and location where they have been tested. We need to focus on arterial routes of passage of cargo if we want to make sure that something which is inherently risky is rendered less risky. And this will be much more useful than a static conception of hotspot red districts and green districts and so forth, because cargo moves from green through orange to red. The other thing we have to remember is that our big manufacturing centers all happen to lie in hotspot districts. And we need to take that on board, but not refrain from opening up these manufacturing centers just because they happen to be in risky hotspots. The same arterial testing protocols can be extended to passage of workers in and out of manufacturing hubs. A passbook with the date and location of their last test, and a requirement that they should be tested every 14 days. If we do this, then we can manage the risk and at the same time open up the economy. My fear is that if we are so risk averse that we will not open up any of these manufacturing hubs, we might as well say goodbye to the Indian economy as we knew it even last year when it had already slowed down. Let me take a particular example. There is a pharmaceutical manufacturing hub in Himachal Pradesh called Baddi, which is in Solan district. Solan district is a red hotspot district, and Baddi itself is a containment zone within that. But it is a very famous pharmaceutical hub. These pharmaceutical hub companies presently in that hub are all closed or near closure because of the fact that they lie in this containment zone. We cannot let that happen. As you know, the global economy itself is expected to go into recession. And the only sector in that economy which is expected to remain alive and buoyant is a pharmaceutical sector. We will lose our export footing in export of generic drugs, for which we are famous. We have a global footprint. We will lose that completely if just because Baddi is in a containment zone, we flinch from opening it up. So we have to think now in terms of testing along arterial passageways, pathways of cargo and workers.
Dr. Rajaraman, isn't this a federal issue as well? Because we have seen a lot of interstate border closing that's happening at the state level, where we have seen this happen between Kerala and Karnataka near Kasargod. We are hearing news of similar types between the Tamil Nadu-Andhra Pradesh border. So while I agree with you that we need the opening up of our arterial systems in our country, can federal concerns play a role in this?
On this issue, I do believe that it is the right of the union government as the guarantor of macroeconomic stability in the country, a task given to the union government under the constitution to require that these pathways should be opened up. It is extremely important to have states agree to these collaborations. If they will not voluntarily surrender control over their borders, there has to be a continuum of center-state communication to impress upon states that this is something they have to do in the interests of the country, and that every protection will be taken to ensure that infection does not spread from one state into another state, which is ultimately what they are interested in fending off. So if we have effective testing along these pathways, I think that can be achieved.
Let's come to the core of our discussion in this episode. So as governments lift the lockdown, they also need to start allocating and spending money, especially with the economy in deep crisis, and which has pretty much been ground to a halt on many fronts. Before getting to what they must spend it on and how, is a spending target of say 5% or 10% of GDP, is this useful at all for India?
I think spending targets of that kind serve no use at all. I know that Arvind Subramaniam and Devesh Kapoor in a sequence of articles have recommended a target of 5% of GDP as a fiscal outlay, so to speak, of a union government towards defraying the cost of this lockdown. Other estimates floating around at 10% simply because the United States did that. I don't think these targets are really very useful at all. At the end of the day, fiscal resources are scarce. And before we venture on any particular fiscal outlay, we have to assess the costs and the benefits and think about whether another use might not be better. At the end, when you have summed them all up, you will arrive at what has been decided. But I don't think it is at all useful to start with the total and work back from that. It's not how much we spend, but what we do and where we spend it that will finally give us what we want, which is the restoration of the economy as we knew it.
So then the real question, what should India's fiscal policy focus on? What problems can and should it tackle?
One of the things that has to be remembered about fiscal assistance, or indeed fiscal flows of any kind, is that they can only be enhanced along pre-existing channels. It is difficult for government at any level to suddenly develop new channels along which funds can flow. And this is because there are protections which have been built into the system because they're dealing with public funds. So in order to prevent government from just throwing money at their discretion wherever they want and whatever they want, these protections have been built in. And we can only work within those limitations. So let me first take up support from the union government, from central support to states. What are the existing channels along which assistance can flow? To the states, the first channel, which is open and which is sanctioned and which is immediately available, is disaster relief. There is a large amount that has been prescribed by the 15th Finance Commission for the current year 2021, and this can be increased manyfold. The great advantage of going with disaster relief as the channel along which to send funds from the central government to the states is that it is not narrowly earmarked. That is to say, a fairly broad spectrum of expenditures can be tolerated from the auditing point of view, simply because this is a disaster and because the state is the best authority to judge on what is the best use of this money. So it is quite free. It's a free flow. It's a well-established channel. The total prescribed amount for this year, aggregating across the state disaster relief contribution and the national disaster relief fund, it's about 40,000 crore. This can be increased fivefold to reach 1% of GDP. So I would say disaster relief is the first channel immediately available and flexible in terms of the uses to which it can be put that should be used for enhancement.
So is this possible only because COVID-19 pandemic has been notified as a specific notified disaster under the Disaster Management Act?
Absolutely. Yes, of course. It is because it has been notified as a disaster that this channel is immediately open. In the normal course, cyclones and so on, which are conventional disasters, are episodes for which this money can be used. But now COVID has been added on. And as I said, it's a pre-existing channel and it offers flexibility in terms of usage.
So what would it take for us to go from 40,000 crores to the fivefold increase that you mentioned of this fund? Is that automatic? Is that within the union government's discretion?
Yes, it is perfectly within the union government's discretion. The present Finance Commission's recommendations have been approved by Parliament. There is this new disaster coloration that has been given to COVID. There is no problem at all. There's no impediment to the centre simply announcing that they are going to enhance this provision. And if need be, the final approval of this can await the next opening of Parliament, which it will presumably do on a virtual basis sometime soon. So I see no impediment at all to enhancing the flow of disaster relief to 1% of GDP immediately.
So two follow-ups on that. One is, okay, if we have a number of this side, even 40,000 crores is a lot to start off with if we look at it from a 1 or 2 month perspective or 3 month perspective.
Yes.
How should this money be distributed across states? And perhaps the question that comes before that, what should the money be given to states for? Should it be largely untied funds where states decide how to spend it?
You've asked two questions. The first was, how do we divide this among states? This is the great advantage of going with the Finance Commission provision. Remember, Finance Commissions sit for 2 years, every 5 years, to judge on the distribution of funds between states. So the allocation of the state disaster relief fund between states has already been done by the Finance Commission. So you're enhancing it using that same distribution formula. There can be no accusation placed against the union government of favoring this state or that state because the formula has been laid down. And you're just going to be enhancing whatever has been prescribed for a particular state, the same way some other state will be enhanced. There will be no difference. And this is particularly justified at this stage because this is a disease that has affected all states. There may be some states which have more green districts than others, but at the end of the day, all states are potential victims of this new disaster that has befallen us. So that is one example of the advantage of going with disaster relief. The formula for interstate allocation already exists.
If there are any hotspots that persist, if there are some places where a COVID-19 pandemic just doesn't go away, then we can think of extra provisions there. But for now, the formulas work.
The formula is for the state component of it. So there are two components to that 40,000 crores. there is the state disaster relief mechanism, and there is the National Disaster Relief Fund. So once a state has exhausted its provision, its allocation, it can then petition the union government for a piece of the National Disaster Relief Fund. And that is where some discretion comes in. But if there is a state which has very persistent containment problems, and if it applies to the National Disaster Fund, its case will obviously take precedence over some other state which does not have that problem. So there is this two-stage formula. There is the State Disaster Relief Fund, to which they have absolute access. And in answer to your other question, they have freedom of usage of that fund to whatever purpose they think appropriate under the circumstances, whether it is personal protection equipment or whether it is medication or extra hospital beds or relief for migrant labor. All of that can be spent on with the State Disaster Relief Fund. And once they have exhausted their particular state allocation, they can petition the National Disaster Relief Fund for more.
Circling back to the state and central responses and the channels that are there for funding, you mentioned disaster relief. The favored approach for many union governments is also the idea of centrally sponsored schemes, right? So are there other avenues that you think are inferior to the disaster management financing route?
Well, I wouldn't classify them or characterize them as inferior. The essential point I wanted to make was this, and it's something that has to be kept in mind. Government can only operate within their rules. These rules are laid out in order to protect us, the public, the taxpayer, from wrong uses of the funds that we have given over to government. So these rules and controls are there for a good reason. By the same token, it does handicap government in terms of the channels along which they can send flow. So that was the sense in which I said that disaster relief is one that is immediately available. But let me go on to other possible channels. As we know, the first and foremost need of the hour is food support for migrant labor and other groups which have been reduced to destitution by this lockdown. This, according to me, can best be spent at the level of states, because it is states which have the information on the basis of which to decide where the food should go and in what quantities. The center cannot decide that. Now, this can be achieved by immediately releasing food stocks from the Food Corporation of India godowns, which could rise to as much as 80 million tons after the Rabi harvest, after the procurement which is currently going on. 80 million tons is something that we don't even have the capacity for to stock. Much of that will rot if it is not given away. So what better than the present opportunity to give away this grain to states? And when you're giving away the grain to states, you don't even have to worry about pre-existing pathways. There is already a provision for selling PDS grain to states, for which they are charged nominally at some 2 or 3 rupees per kilogram. All you have to do is to waive that charge, open the godowns, ask the states to take as much as they want, and open up feeding centers for the indigent in their states, in urban areas, or in taluk headquarters or district headquarters, and not worry about the allocation of that between states. You just wait for states to come forward and take whatever they will. And the aggregate of what they will all take will surely be less than the 80 million tons that we will have in our stocks.
And are these FCI godowns spread across the country? So will all states have direct physical access to local FCI storage centers?
Yes, there is a spread. There is a network of godowns. So in principle, the distance from the accession point to the, let's say, the state headquarters, the state capital, should not be too great, or the points of distribution. So there is a network in place. There may be more grain near the procurement centers for the newly procured grain, but we've already opened up truck and rail transport of cargo. In fact, even during lockdown 1, a transport of food grain was fully and freely permitted. So there should be no problem on that front at all. It's just that the decision has to be taken by the center to whittle down this food stock to near zero if need be, because we are facing a huge potential hunger crisis, and we don't want people to die of hunger.
Any other specific suggestions that you would like to make on what should be the fiscal focus? We should, of course, leave it to the states when it comes to how they choose to spend their health resources. Any recommendations on your end?
Another thing that can be done along pre-existing channels is that the amount that has been prescribed by the 15th Finance Commission for the current fiscal year in terms of tax devolution and its distribution between states, as I said, this is a pre-existing channel and the formula pre-exists. The allocation has been decided on by Parliament. No one can question it. These amounts can be enhanced. This is independent of the disaster relief. This is just enhancement of the tax devolution. And that too is, I believe, something that can be easily done by ordinance initially if need be, and with subsequent parliamentary approval, which would surely be given. And the difference is that unlike the disaster relief, which is in general applicable to any expenditure that the state judges to be necessary to cope with the disaster that it is facing, in this case, these amounts, these enhancements of the 15th Finance Commission provision, I believe could be earmarked for specific purposes. And one specific purpose that I think is exceedingly important is to ensure that the state has the wherewithal with which to engage for the transportation of agricultural produce, not grain, but horticulture and other perishable products from the farm to the markets, which is something which would have happened in the normal course routinely, but is not happening now because truck operators are not willing to take the risk of picking up the produce and trucking it to a market center which is closed. Who bears the risk of that? Who will pay the truck operator if that produce cannot be sold? So it is only government, and in this case, state government, which can pick up the tab on that to pick up the produce, truck it to a market, make sure that the market opens, arrange for the further distribution of that downstream to retail centers. If this is not done, and if it is not done immediately, what we will have will be a huge, unavoidable loss of our agricultural produce this year. As I said, not of food grain, but of other food crops. Already the mango crop is rotting at source. We will avoid the kind of destitution farmers will face for no fault of their own. And we will also avoid the kind of urban food inflation, which many fear will happen simply because supplies are not coming into urban markets. Already, we are beginning to see the prices of foodstuffs in urban areas rise, and that is not something we want at this juncture, particularly when it can be avoided by a very, very quick transfer of fiscal wherewithal from the center to states earmarked for a particular purpose.
So between the union government and the state governments, is there a case for fiscal support to the private sector? There is expenditure that is there on many counts, but on the fiscal front, does the private sector need help from states and union governments right now?
The plea of the private sector that they are deserving of assistance is certainly justified, because what has happened is that they were handed, the lockdown essentially meant that they were given an unfunded mandate. They were mandated to close down, and their losses on account of all their fixed costs, including, their wage bill, salary bill, all of these were left unfunded at the time at which the lockdown was introduced. So their claim for assistance is certainly justified. The great problem is, in India particularly, is that we don't have a standard operating procedure in place whereby funds for this kind of assistance can flow from government at any level to the private sector. Remember what I earlier said, that for fiscal assistance to flow immediately and without impediment and without later questions asked, it has to flow along pre-existing channels along which funds can flow, are permitted to flow. Now, we don't have a standard operating procedure for that. In Canada or in Europe, they do. They do have a system whereby wage protection payments can go to the private sector, calibrated to the number of workers, which they already have in their database. And this can go even when demand dips a little bit. And it can even go on an industry-specific basis. So, for instance, if the producer of Mercedes cars finds that the demand for Mercedes cars has dipped, they can apply for wage protection payments. So it is very industry-specific, all industry can apply, and there is an SOP in place. We don't have that. We don't have a way by which payments can flow. We don't have a budget head under which payments can flow from government at any level to the private sector. There is another problem with giving money to the private sector outside established channels. And it is this: how do you judge which sector is more deserving than the other? So, for instance, the aviation sector might seem to be a prime candidate because they were the ones who were asked not to operate any of their flights. However, if you're going to compensate the aviation sector, what about the informal labor, the informal workers in the travel and transportation and tourism sectors? They, if anything, are far poorer than employees at the upper ranks of the aviation sector. So these kinds of decisions are very painful and difficult to make. These kinds of prioritizations, which sector gets the assistance, which sector doesn't. So there is already a pre-existing channel along which funds can flow and in fact are due to the private sector from government at all levels and also from public sector enterprises. And that is delayed payments to the private sector from the government. It is no secret that in the past several years, the fiscal deficit of government has been sought to be contained within the limits of the FRBM Acts simply by delaying payments due to private vendors who have already delivered the goods or built the roads or whatever and just not being paid. Industry organizations have estimated the total of these delayed payments at somewhere in the order of 2 lakh crore, that is to say 1% of GDP. Now, even if a small portion of this were to begin flowing, this would already be a huge help to the private sector. There is no question of allocation or deciding or prioritization because these payments are due and they should have already been paid, but were not. And this is the time at which to catch up on that. And it would introduce justice into the system. It would restore the faith of the private sector in the public sector and in government generally. It would get rid of the trust deficit that has built up between the private sector and government. It's a pre-existing channel. You know what is due where. So that is another thing that can be done before we think of what percentage of GDP we need to give to the private sector or whether to give money to the aviation sector or not.
So it is state support for our supply chains on many fronts, starting with food and perishable food.
Absolutely, that's right.
Dr. Rajaraman, so far we've largely talked about fiscal policy and what all it can do and what all it must do immediately. What about monetary policy so far? Have the monetary measures that have been taken by the RBI, have they been adequate? Have they been timely?
Absolutely. I think the RBI has done a splendid job. In fact, so far, it is the RBI which has been doing the heavy lifting in terms of addressing the economic problem that faces us. And they have been doing this along 3 lines. One is that they have done a lot for enhancing liquidity in the system. And as you know, they have particularly introduced a new innovation, which are these targeted long-term repo operations to ease liquidity constraints in the banking system and to de-stress financial markets. And these targeted long-term repo auctions are designed to favor particular enterprises in the country which are facing a financial problem on account of not being able to sell their products and all the rest of it, the problems that they are facing. So already, I believe they have done long-term repo operations totaling 1 lakh crore. And on the 17th of April, a further enhancement of 50,000 crore was done, particularly targeting non-bank finance companies. So a huge support of the kind needed along the lines of liquidity provision. The second thing that they have done and tried very energetically to do, but unfortunately it has not met with a very good response, is to facilitate and incentivize bank credit flows. And to this end, the fixed rate reverse repo has even been reduced further to 3.75% in order to prevent banks from just taking all this extra liquidity in the system and depositing it back with the RBI instead of lending it out as credit, which is what the RBI wants them to do. Banks, like all other organizations, commercial organizations in the system, are very risk averse at this point. And their stance is perfectly understandable because this epidemic has come on top of a previous banking crisis that we already had when they were already risk averse. So this particular episode has not made them lose that risk aversion. On the contrary, it has deepened it. So the RBI is trying with all the instruments at its disposal to incentivize bank credit flows with not as much success because at the end of the day, banks have to respond. But the effort is very worthwhile. And it's possible that the reverse repo rate might be reduced even further. So they have done liquidity provision. They have facilitated and incentivized bank credit flows. And they have also, very importantly, eased stress in the banking system by a huge amount of regulatory forbearance. There's been a 3-month moratorium on dues to the banking system, which was further expanded to a standstill on those accounts. The resolution time under the bankruptcy code has been increased to 300 days from 210 days. The liquidity coverage ratio has been reduced immediately from 100% to 80%. A large number of avenues along which forbearance has been introduced on the regulatory front in order to loosen the ties around the banking system. Remember, those constraints on the banking system were indeed introduced for a specific purpose, to make sure that banks functioned along prudential lines. But now they have relaxed them in view of the circumstances. And so I think the RBI has been quick off the mark. It has responded very nimbly and flexibly to what needed to be done. I know that there has been some criticism from an assortment of quarters that the Monetary Policy Committee has not been sufficiently consulted, or that these measures have not been routed through them. But this was an emergency, and we don't know that the Monetary Policy Committee external members were not consulted. The fact that they were consulted was not revealed, but that does not necessarily mean that they were left out of the picture.
So in effect, Dr. Rajaraman, the primary private sector support comes from monetary policy beyond the one specific measure that you currently mentioned on the fiscal front, which is release of pending payments. Am I correct in inferring that?
So far, the biggest relief to the private sector has come from the RBI. And beyond what I mentioned, working capital limits, margins have all been expanded. And most recently, as you know, there's a further provision of 50,000 crores for banks to borrow to support mutual funds. So a lot has been done to ease stress in financial markets, to help the private sector. And this has been timely at all times, even at the best of times in textbook economics. You know that monetary policy is what can be done quickly. Fiscal policy takes time because fiscal decisions have to be passed through the parliament of the day. So that monetary policy is quicker and lends itself more nimbly to address, a disaster of this kind or a normal economic downturn. This is something that is well known. And so that this should have happened at this juncture should not be surprising. But let me mention once again that fiscal flows from the center to states for disaster relief can also be done immediately. It's not as though it is impeded by any institutional requirements. And also the additional flows that I mentioned to support, picking up agricultural produce and conveying it to the market, that too is something that can be done immediately. And of course, payment of past dues is something that can be done absolutely tomorrow. So all of this will require extra central borrowing from financial markets. And I think most economists are agreed that for the RBI to monetize those borrowings at this juncture would not be improper at all. In fact, that is the way to go. So really, there are no impediments even to quick fiscal actions along the avenues that I mentioned.
Thank you so much for giving us this set of recommendations and set of ideas on what the government can do right now, not 2 months from now, not 3 months from now, but right now. Could I ask you to share your parting thoughts for our listeners on how they should parse government actions as we enter the month of May beyond what we've discussed so far?
As I said earlier, the key to opening up the economy, to reducing the impact of the lockdown on the economy, the key is to have testing for this disease move pari passu with the opening of the economy along the pathways that the economy is being opened up. So it is not anymore a question of a static categorization of the country into red, orange, and green. We have to have goods, cargo move from one part of the country to another across zones of all kinds of colors. We need to have people carrying those goods. We need to have cargo handlers, truck drivers moving with the goods and be willing to move with those goods. And we have to, at the same time, make sure that workers can reach these manufacturing units that are opened up, hoping that many more will be opened up. So we need to deploy testing resources in a dynamic way along these arterial pathways and not have them, be distributed. Testing resources are also very scarce at this point, be distributed in some kind of static fashion between red and green districts and so on. That's one thing. The testing resources have to be distributed along pathways. The other thing is that the testing resource constraint has to be lifted. A lot of manufacturing enterprises which can produce the chemicals needed and the other accoutrements needed for producing testing kits need to be converted to the production of those testing kits. And most of all, we need to have manufacturing enterprises which can shift to production of personal protection equipment, PPEs as they are called. We need to have them shift to that so that those are not constrained. I don't know if my figures are correct, but I believe India has one of the highest rates of infection among health workers. And that is very shameful and very constraining because doctors and nurses and other frontline workers will not want to report to duty if as a result they're going to be infected themselves. So lifting the PPE constraint, lifting the testing resources constraint by converting whatever manufacturing facilities can be converted to the production of these at short notice. That is the need of the hour, and deployment along passageways of cargo and people rather than deployment scattered in a sort of static way across different color-coded districts is, I think, the need of the hour.
Dr. Rajaraman, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks. You have given us so many ideas to chew on.
Thank you.
This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from Sarvanaraj, and the episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. You can get our podcasts on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in for new episodes every week. Check out Bangalore International Centre on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And don't forget to regularly check in on our podcasts.